Lightning tears through the darkness above the Black Pacific on the last day of March in 1944, and inside a Kawanishi flying boat, struggling through winds that seem determined to tear the aircraft apart, a man sits clutching a leather briefcase that contains what he believes to be Japan's salvation. Admiral Manechi Koga can feel every violent shudder of the aircraft as it fights against nature's fury at 2,000 feet, rain battering the hull with such force that it sounds like they're taking enemy fire. When he peers through the small window beside his seat, there's nothing visible except churning water far below and clouds illuminated sporadically by flashes of electrical discharge that briefly turn night into day. The storm concerns him less than what rests in that briefcase against his leg. Pages upon pages of meticulous strategic planning that the finest military minds in the empire have poured their expertise into creating. The Z-Plan represents more than just another military operation. It embodies Japan's final opportunity to turn the tide of a war that has started to slip away from their grasp. Every calculation has been verified, every contingency considered, every possible American move anticipated and countered. The document details how the enemy will inevitably approach from the eastern reaches of the Pacific, throwing their forces against the fortress islands that Japan has transformed into nearly impregnable bastions of concrete and steel and determination. Jaluit, Mail, Votja, Maluelap, each one bristling with artillery and defended by thousands of soldiers who have sworn to fight to their last breath. The Americans will bleed themselves dry against these prepared positions, their fleet gradually weakening until the moment arrives for Japan's combined naval forces to surge forth from their base at Truk like a blade drawn from its sheath, annihilating what remains of the enemy's Pacific naval power in one climactic engagement. It follows the logic that any competent military commander would employ, attacking the targets that present themselves most obviously, engaging the enemy where fortifications and geography favor the defender. Koga adjusts the cap on his head and continues staring into the tempest beyond the aircraft's hull. 59 years of life and decades of naval service weighing on him like physical burdens. He carries the hopes of an entire nation, following in the footsteps of Yamamoto, that legendary figure who orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack and had the fortune to perish before experiencing the bitter taste of sustained defeat. Now the responsibility falls to Koga to extract victory from circumstances that grow more desperate with each passing month. His aide leans close, voice barely cutting through the engine roar, suggesting they might need to divert to an alternate landing site given the storm's intensity. Koga cuts him off immediately, his tone carrying the weight of authority that comes from a lifetime spent in command positions. They will proceed to Davao exactly as planned, he insists, because the fleet awaits their arrival, and the timing of their operations cannot be disrupted by mere weather. What this admiral cannot possibly know as his aircraft continues its doomed flight through the storm toward the watery grave that awaits him is that 600 miles distant, American codebreakers are already reading his most classified communications with disturbing ease. Filipino resistance fighters have recovered the Z-Plan from a different crashed aircraft, and intelligence officers in the United States military are studying every word of Japan's supposedly perfect strategy with great interest. But the truly shocking element isn't this intelligence breakthrough. It's what the Americans have decided to do with the information they've acquired. They're planning to completely ignore everything the Z-Plan anticipates. While Admiral Koga sits in his aircraft, completely confident that he understands American thinking, their methods of conducting warfare, the inevitable approaches they must take toward his defensive perimeter, the United States Pacific Fleet is preparing to execute an operation that will demolish not merely Japanese defenses, but the entire conceptual framework through which Japanese military leadership understands modern combat. The Americans are on the verge of demonstrating that the most destructive weapon available in warfare isn't superior numbers or better fortifications or more advanced technology. It's the capacity to render your opponent's entire strategic planning completely meaningless. How could the most accomplished naval strategists in Japan be so utterly wrong about American intentions? Understanding the magnitude of this miscalculation requires stepping into the boots of Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama as he stands on a wooden dock at Kwajalein Atoll on the 15th of January in 1944. The morning sun creates reflections on the lagoon's crystalline water, and in the distance he observes the concrete fortifications and gun positions that represent months of exhausting construction labor. Akiyama commands the 6th Base Force, serving as the central nervous system for Japanese operations across the Marshall Islands. From his headquarters, positioned on Kwajalein, he coordinates defensive preparations for an island chain extending across hundreds of miles of Pacific waters. The responsibility weighs heavily, particularly now that everyone recognizes the Americans are coming, though the exact timing remains uncertain. Yet Akiyama feels no particular anxiety about Kwajalein itself. Why would he? The strategic situation appears clear when examined logically. During morning briefings with his staff officers, Akiyama explains his reasoning with confidence that stems from experience rather than blind optimism. The American mentality is methodical and predictable, he tells them. They will assault Jaluit or Mile first, perhaps Votje. Their military culture lacks the imagination required for unconventional approaches. This isn't arrogance speaking, but rather conclusions drawn from solid intelligence and decades studying American military behavior. The outer Marshall Islands have been transformed into defensive strongholds. Jaluit alone houses more than 3,500 troops and massive coastal artillery pieces. Mile boasts over 2,500 soldiers and some of the finest fortifications constructed anywhere in the Pacific Theater. These islands form a barrier that any rational enemy must neutralize before penetrating deeper into Japanese-controlled territory. This represents the fundamental nature of warfare as it has been conducted throughout history. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles distant at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz examines aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across the conference table before him. His intelligence officers have just completed a briefing that would seem impossible to Japanese strategic planners. The Americans are preparing to bypass every major fortress island and strike directly at the heart of the Marshall Island defensive network. Nimitz places his finger on the map, tracing a line that skips entirely over Jaluit, Mile and Votje, explaining to the assembled officers that they're proceeding straight to Kwajalein. The silence filling the room carries its own weight. Even American officers find the proposal audacious to the point of recklessness. Kwajalein isn't merely positioned behind Japanese defensive lines, it serves as the administrative center for the entire Marshall Island defensive network. The comparison would be like attacking an enemy's brain while leaving his fists completely intact and functional. But that's precisely the strategic logic driving the plan. American intelligence has uncovered something the Japanese don't expect them to know. Kwajalein actually represents the weakest link in the defensive chain. While outer islands have been fortified to extraordinary levels, Kwajalein holds only approximately 1,100 combat-effective troops. The remainder of its 5,000-person garrison consists of Korean laborers, construction workers, and support personnel who have never been trained for actual combat. Back on Kwajalein, Akiyama confronts problems whose full dimensions he doesn't yet comprehend. His diary entries, recovered after the battle's conclusion, reveal a man growing increasingly anxious about American reconnaissance flights that follow no logical pattern. The enemy aircraft photograph areas that make no strategic sense, he writes, on the 20th of January. Why do they repeatedly overfly our lagoon approaches when our main defenses face the ocean. Their intelligence must be faulty, but Akiyama's confusion extends beyond tactical puzzlement into something deeper and more fundamental. Like every Japanese officer, he received training in a military tradition that emphasizes decisive battle, honor through direct confrontation, and the spiritual superiority that comes from accepting the strongest enemy challenge. The concept that an enemy might simply avoid your strengths doesn't fit into this framework. It's not merely unfamiliar, it borders on insulting to traditional military thinking. Consider the Japanese military mindset in early 1944. This represents a martial culture that produced the samurai tradition, that reveres death before dishonor, that views strategic retreat as fundamentally cowardly. When Admiral Koga designed the Z Plan, he wasn't merely creating a military strategy, but expressing fundamental Japanese beliefs about how honorable warriors should conduct themselves in warfare. You meet your enemy's strength directly. You prove your superiority through confrontation. You accept battle on terms that test courage and resolve. The Americans, Japanese leadership believes, will have to fight this way too. There's no alternative for them. There's no other path to victory in warfare, because that's how real war has always been conducted throughout history. But what if the Americans don't share these cultural beliefs? What if they view war not as a test of spiritual strength, but as a problem requiring the most efficient possible solution? What if they're willing to win without glory, to bypass honor in favor of effectiveness, to allow enemy fortresses to become strategically irrelevant while striking where opposition is weakest? On the 29th of January in 1944, American carrier aircraft begin preliminary bombardment of Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands. But instead of concentrating firepower on the outer fortress islands as anticipated, they hit targets scattered across the entire island chain. Akiyama watches from his command bunker as explosions bloom across distant atolls. "They're softening up everything," his communications officer reports. "Jaluit, Mile, Votje, Majuro. And sir, they're hitting our position here too." Akiyama nods grimly, believing the Americans are finally revealing their intentions. This widespread bombing campaign confirms Japanese expectations. The Americans are preparing for systematic assault on multiple fortress positions simultaneously. It will prove costly for them, but at least it makes strategic sense, according to conventional military doctrine. What Akiyama fails to realize is that he's witnessing the most sophisticated deception operation in naval warfare history. The Americans aren't softening up targets for invasion. They're concealing their true intentions behind a smokescreen of universal destruction. The real blow is scheduled for tomorrow, and when it falls, everything will change. The first explosions shatter the pre-dawn silence over Kwajalein Atoll at 5:47 in the morning on the 31st of January in 1944, sounding like the world ending. Admiral Akiyama bolts upright from sleep as his entire command bunker shakes violently. Concrete dust rains from the ceiling. Outside, the thunder of naval gunfire rolls across the lagoon in continuous, devastating waves. Through the narrow observation slit in the bunker wall, he can see muzzle flashes lighting up the horizon like deadly constellations. But something about this picture is wrong, terribly and impossibly wrong. His aide bursts through the bunker door, helmet askew and eyes wide with shock. "The American fleet," he gasps. "They're not where they're supposed to be." Akiyama grabs his binoculars and rushes to the observation post. What he sees through the magnified lenses defies everything he thought he understood about warfare, about American military doctrine, about the fundamental nature of strategic planning itself. The United States Pacific Fleet isn't attacking Jaluit. It isn't pounding the massive fortifications at Mile or Votje. Instead, 8 American battleships are sitting in the Kwajalein Lagoon inside his defensive perimeter, methodically destroying everything in sight with the precision of industrial machinery. How did they penetrate our outer defenses? Akiyama whispers, his voice barely audible over the bombardment. The answer is as simple as it is revolutionary. They didn't penetrate the outer defenses, they went around them entirely. While Japanese commanders spent months preparing for frontal assaults on their fortress islands, the Americans developed something completely new. A strategy so audacious that it didn't exist in Japanese military thinking at all. They called it island hopping, though that bland term completely fails to capture the psychological devastation it's about to unleash on Japanese strategic planning. The battleship New Mexico opens fire with her 14-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. The first salvo brackets the main command bunker. The second finds its range precisely. Akiyama watches in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed defensive positions simply cease to exist under the methodical American bombardment. But the naval gunfire represents just the opening act. At 6:15 in the morning, the sky fills with the drone of aircraft engines, not the handful of planes that might support a traditional amphibious assault, but wave after wave of carrier aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, more aircraft than Akiyama has seen in his entire military career. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nabata, stationed at the airfield, records in his diary what happens next. "The enemy planes came out of the sun like a plague of locusts," he writes. "Our fighters tried to respond, but they were outnumbered 20-1. I watched zero after zero fall burning into the lagoon until there were no more zeros left to fall. By 7 in the morning, 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshall Islands have been destroyed. The remainder flee to distant bases, leaving the island garrisons completely defenseless against air attack." This is the moment when Japanese strategic thinking doesn't just fail, but shatters completely. You have to understand, every Japanese plan for defending the Marshall Islands was based on the assumption that Americans would fight the expected war. They would attack the strongest points first, seeking decisive battle, accepting massive casualties for the honor of direct confrontation. The outer fortress islands were supposed to attract American attention, to draw them into grinding attritional warfare where Japanese spiritual superiority could triumph over American material advantages. Instead, the Americans treated Japanese fortress islands like obstacles to be avoided. They left 11,000 Japanese troops on the outer islands to wither on the vine, starving, cut off from supplies, militarily irrelevant, while striking at the one point where Japanese defenses were thinnest. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders is immediate and devastating. Colonel Tarukichi Aso, commanding the 729 men of the Wotje detachment who had just arrived on Kwajalein for transfer, stares at the American fleet through his field glasses. "This is not warfare," he mutters to his aide. "This is something else entirely." What Aso is witnessing represents the birth of modern asymmetric warfare, the idea that victory comes not from defeating the enemy's strength, but from making his strength irrelevant. At 9:30 in the morning, the first American landing craft hit the beaches. Major General Charles Corlitt's 7th Infantry Division doesn't charge into withering defensive fire like the Marines did at Tarawa. Instead, they wade ashore on beaches that have been so thoroughly pulverized by naval gunfire that one British observer later wrote that nothing could have lived through that sea and air bombardment, describing how the beach was littered with highly colored fish that had been thrown up there by nearby explosions. The prepared Japanese defenses, the gun positions, the concrete bunkers, the carefully sited machine gun nests have been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. Most of the Korean laborers and support personnel surrender immediately, having never expected to fight a battle at all. But it's not just the physical destruction that breaks Japanese resistance, it's the complete psychological disorientation of fighting an enemy who refuses to follow the rules. Akiyama retreats to his final command bunker, trying desperately to coordinate a defense against an attack that shouldn't be happening according to every principle of warfare he understands. His radio crackles with confused reports from his surviving units. "Sir, the Americans have landed at 3 different points simultaneously. They're using some kind of amphibious tanks. We've never seen anything like them. Our coastal guns can't depress low enough to hit their landing craft in the lagoon. Every defensive plan, every carefully prepared position, every tactical doctrine developed over decades of military training has become useless overnight. The Americans aren't just winning the battle, they're winning so easily that Japanese resistance collapses into bewildered chaos." By noon, American forces have advanced halfway across Kwajalein Island. By evening, organized Japanese resistance has effectively ended. In less than 18 hours, the administrative center of Japanese power in the Marshall Islands has fallen to an enemy attack that Japanese strategic doctrine insisted was impossible. The numbers tell their own devastating story. Out of 5,000 Japanese on Kwajalein, only 265 survive as prisoners. American casualties number just 177 killed and 1,000 wounded. It's not a battle in the traditional sense. It's a systematic demolition carried out with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when Akiyama, wounded and trapped in his final bunker, realizes that the Americans aren't even planning to attack the fortress islands at all. Radio intercepts reveal that Jaluit, Maile and Voce, the supposedly critical defensive positions that absorbed so much Japanese effort and resources, are simply being bypassed completely. 11,000 Japanese soldiers will spend the rest of the war sitting on heavily fortified islands that no longer matter to anyone strategically. As American soldiers finally breach his command bunker, Akiyama experiences something no Japanese officer had ever been trained to process: the complete irrelevance of everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Americans hadn't just defeated Japanese defenses. They had made Japanese defenses meaningless. Standing in the smoking ruins of his command post, surrounded by American soldiers who look more like factory workers than samurai warriors, Akiyama understands with crystal clarity that this represents not just a tactical defeat, but the end of an entire way of thinking about war, honor, and the nature of military conflict itself. The age of fortress warfare, of meeting strength with strength, of proving superiority through direct confrontation, dies with him in that bunker on Kwajalein Atoll. What's being born in its place will reshape not just the Pacific War, but the entire future of global conflict. The silence in Admiral Soemu Toyoda's office in Tokyo is deafening. It's the 8th of February in 1944, 1 week after the fall of Kwajalein, and Toyoda, newly appointed to replace the deceased Admiral Koga, stares at intelligence reports that read like science fiction. The Americans have captured the heart of the Marshall Island Defense Network in 4 days. 11,000 Japanese troops remain stranded on outer islands that the Americans simply ignored. The entire strategic framework of Japanese Pacific defense has collapsed like a house of cards. How? Toyoda asks his intelligence officer. How did we miss this completely? The answer sits in a manila folder on his desk. The captured Z plan that Filipino guerrillas had fished from a crashed aircraft months earlier. Every Japanese defensive position, every strategic assumption, every tactical doctrine had been laid bare to American intelligence. But even more devastating than this intelligence failure was the deeper psychological blindness it revealed. Japanese military thinking had become trapped in its own cultural assumptions. The belief that honor required meeting enemy strength directly. The conviction that Americans would fight like Japanese, seeking decisive battle where defenses were strongest. The inability to conceive that an enemy might simply walk away from your strengths to strike at your weaknesses. For surviving Japanese commanders like Toyoda, the shock was transformational and permanent. Post-war interrogations reveal officers who described feeling like they had been fighting ghosts, an enemy that refused to behave predictably, that treated war as an engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Lieutenant Commander Nabata, one of the few survivors from Kwajalein's airfield, later wrote that they spent months preparing for the wrong war. While we built fortresses, they built flexibility. While we concentrated forces, they concentrated intelligence. While we prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely. The psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Field commanders began second-guessing every defensive plan. Was this position too obvious? Would the Americans simply bypass it? How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to attack your defenses? But the Americans weren't finished revolutionizing warfare. What happened in the Marshalls was just the beginning of a strategic transformation that would define the rest of the Pacific Campaign. Over the following months, United States forces would leapfrog across the Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Mariana Islands fell in summer 1944, bringing those massive B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Philippines were reconquered through a combination of amphibious assaults and brilliant tactical bypassing of Japanese strongpoints. Each victory validated the new American approach to warfare: strike where the enemy is weakest, make his strengths irrelevant, win through superior intelligence and operational flexibility rather than superior courage or willingness to die. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was enormous and tragic. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves marooned on bypassed islands, slowly starving while the war moved past them like a tide flowing around rocks. They had been prepared to die gloriously in battle. Instead, they died slowly and pointlessly, victims of a strategic doctrine that had been rendered obsolete overnight. Today, military strategists study the Marshall Islands campaign as the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The principles pioneered by American forces in 1944, avoiding enemy strengths, exploiting intelligence advantages, prioritizing operational speed over tactical perfectionism, became the foundation for everything from Cold War proxy conflicts to contemporary counter-terrorism operations. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological rather than tactical. The Japanese commanders, who were so shocked by American island hopping, weren't stupid or incompetent. They were trapped by their own cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought, how enemies should behave, how honor and effectiveness should balance against each other. In boardrooms and military academies around the world, the story of Japanese strategic blindness has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption-based planning. How many businesses have failed by assuming competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many military campaigns have crumbled when enemies refused to fight the expected battle? The storm that claimed Admiral Koga's life on the 31st of March in 1944 was more than just a meteorological accident. It was symbolic of the tempest that American strategic innovation was about to unleash across the Pacific theater. Japanese commanders had prepared for everything except an enemy that would change the rules of war itself. Standing in the ruins of Kwajalein Atoll, surrounded by the debris of obsolete defensive thinking, Japanese military forces confronted a brutal truth. The age of fortress warfare was ending. The age of maneuver warfare, information warfare, and strategic flexibility had begun. The Americans hadn't just shocked Japanese commanders with their island-hopping strategy. They had shocked the world into a new understanding of what warfare could become when intelligence, innovation, and willingness to break conventional rules combined into a new doctrine. The fall of Kwajalein sent shockwaves through not just military circles, but the highest levels of government in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito himself demanded explanations for how such a catastrophic intelligence failure could occur. How had the Americans penetrated so deeply into Japanese-held territory with such apparent ease? Why had the fortress islands that consumed so much labor and material proven utterly worthless? The answers, when they came, were even more disturbing than the defeat itself. The problem wasn't that Japanese intelligence had failed to detect American movements. Reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the American fleet. Radio intercepts had picked up increased enemy communications. The problem was that Japanese military culture had no framework for interpreting what they were seeing. When intelligence officers reported that American forces appeared to be bypassing the fortress islands, their superiors dismissed these reports as impossible. No rational commander would leave such threats intact, they reasoned. The Americans must be planning a feint, a deception to mask their real intentions. This cognitive bias, this inability to believe that an enemy might operate according to completely different principles, cost Japan dearly. The bypassed fortress islands became monuments to strategic inflexibility. On Jaluit, more than 3,500 soldiers sat in their fortifications as the war passed them by. They had ammunition for battles that would never come. They had provisions that would slowly run out while American supply convoys sailed past just beyond artillery range. Officers on these islands sent increasingly desperate messages to Tokyo requesting instructions. Should they attempt to evacuate, launch suicide attacks against American shipping, simply wait for the enemy to eventually come for them? The answer from headquarters was always the same. Hold your positions, maintain defensive readiness. The Americans will have to deal with you eventually. But the Americans never did. The bypassed garrisons became invisible to American strategic planning, not worth the casualties that reducing them would require. Some Japanese soldiers on these islands wouldn't learn the war had ended until months after the surrender, living in a bubble of irrelevance while history moved on without them. The psychological toll on these men was devastating. They had been trained to believe that death in battle was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. Instead, they faced slow starvation and the gnawing realization that they had become strategically meaningless. Back in the Japanese mainland, military planners scrambled to adapt to the new American way of war. If fortress islands could be bypassed, what defensive strategy could possibly work? Some argued for abandoning fixed fortifications entirely in favor of mobile defense. Others insisted on concentrating forces at what they believed would be the Americans' ultimate objectives. But every plan suffered from the same fundamental problem. How do you defend against an enemy who refuses to attack where you expect? The Japanese response to this dilemma reveals much about the limitations of military doctrine when confronted with revolutionary change. Instead of fundamentally rethinking their approach to Pacific defense, Japanese planners simply tried to fortify more places. If the Americans could bypass some islands, they reasoned, we'll fortify all the islands. If they can strike at weak points, we'll eliminate weak points by making everywhere strong. This logic was superficially sound, but practically impossible. Japan lacked the resources to fortify every position adequately. Spreading forces thinly across dozens of islands meant that the Americans could still concentrate overwhelming force against any single point they chose to attack. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how thoroughly American strategic thinking had evolved. Japanese naval commanders, still clinging to the dream of decisive battle that had animated the Z Plan, attempted to engage the American fleet in what they hoped would be a war-winning confrontation. Instead, they sailed into a massacre that American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft were shot down in staggering numbers, their pilots inadequately trained because the veterans had been killed in earlier battles and Japan lacked the resources to properly train replacements. The American victory wasn't just tactical, it was systematic. the result of superior intelligence that allowed American forces to position themselves advantageously, superior radar that gave them earlier warning of Japanese attacks, superior training that made American pilots far more effective than their Japanese counterparts. Every advantage the Americans possessed stemmed from the same strategic insight that had guided the Kwajalein operation. Identify your strengths, identify enemy weaknesses, and fight in ways that maximize the former while exploiting the latter. By late 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. American forces were advancing across the Pacific at a pace that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Saipan fell, then Tinian, then Guam. Each battle followed the same template: overwhelming preparatory bombardment, amphibious assault at carefully chosen points, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, launching banzai charges that resulted in horrific casualties on both sides. But courage without effective strategy proved insufficient. The mathematics of attrition favored the Americans, who could replace losses far more easily than Japan could. For Japanese soldiers fighting these battles, the experience must have been surreal. They had been told their spiritual superiority would overcome American material advantages. They had been assured that the enemy lacked the will to sustain heavy casualties. They had believed that Bushido, the warrior code, would prove decisive when inferior Western materialism faltered. Instead, they discovered that the Americans possessed both material superiority and the will to use it effectively. More devastatingly, they discovered that the Americans had figured out how to minimize their own casualties while maximizing Japanese losses through superior tactics and technology. The psychological impact extended beyond the military to Japanese society as a whole. Citizens who had been assured of ultimate victory began to doubt official pronouncements. Workers in factories producing weapons wondered if their efforts made any difference when American bombers could strike with apparent impunity. The gap between official propaganda and obvious reality grew wider with each American advance. Some Japanese leaders recognized the implications. If the Americans had revolutionized warfare to this degree, if traditional Japanese strategic thinking was obsolete, then perhaps the war itself was unwinnable. But speaking such thoughts aloud bordered on treason. The military government that had led Japan into war could not admit fundamental error without undermining its own legitimacy. So the war continued, driven by institutional inertia and the inability of leaders to accept what battlefield results made increasingly obvious. The story of American island hopping isn't just about military tactics. It's about the nature of innovation and the difficulty of recognizing when fundamental rules have changed. Japanese commanders in 1944 faced a challenge that recurs throughout history. How do you respond when your opponent does something that your entire framework for understanding the world says is impossible? Consider the parallels to business disruption in peacetime. How many established companies have failed because they couldn't imagine competitors violating industry norms? How many Kodaks have been destroyed by digital photography they saw coming but couldn't bring themselves to embrace? How many blockbusters have been demolished by streaming services that didn't follow the rules of physical retail? The Japanese military in 1944 was Blockbuster, confronting Netflix, unable to believe that customers would abandon video stores for a different model entirely. The lesson extends to individuals as well. How often do we construct mental models of how things work, then defend those models against contrary evidence, because accepting that we're wrong would require rebuilding our understanding from scratch? Admiral Akiyama, standing on Kwajalein in January 1944, absolutely certain that Americans would attack the Fortress Islands first, represents all of us when we're most confident about predictions that turn out to be catastrophically wrong. The Americans who planned the Marshall Islands operation understood something profound about strategic thinking. The most vulnerable moment for any organization, any military, any individual, is when they're most confident they understand how things work. That confidence creates blindness to alternative approaches. It turns strengths into weaknesses by making you predictable. It allows cleverer opponents to make you irrelevant by changing the game you're playing. Japanese fortress islands were magnificent examples of military engineering. The concrete bunkers could withstand tremendous punishment. The artillery pieces were precisely sited to cover likely approach routes. The soldiers manning these positions were well trained and motivated. None of it mattered, because the Americans simply chose not to play the game those fortifications were designed for. In post-war interviews, surviving Japanese officers repeatedly described feeling like they'd been fighting ghosts. The Americans were there, and then they weren't. They attacked where they were weak instead of where they were strong. They won battles without the climactic confrontations that Japanese doctrine said were necessary. It violated every principle these officers had absorbed during their careers. Some never recovered psychologically from the experience. They had built their identities around being professional military officers who understood warfare, and that understanding had been revealed as incomplete at best, dangerously wrong at worst. The final months of the war saw Japan attempting increasingly desperate measures to counter American advantages. Kamikaze attacks represented an attempt to negate American material superiority through sheer willingness to die. If one pilot could sink a ship by crashing into it, perhaps spiritual strength could trump industrial capacity after all. But even kamikaze attacks ultimately proved insufficient. American ships developed better defensive tactics, better radar, better fighter coverage. The exchange rate of kamikaze pilots to ships sunk favored the Americans, who could afford losses better than Japan could afford training and equipping suicide attackers. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan's military had been so thoroughly defeated that occupation forces landed without significant resistance. The fortress mentality that had shaped Japanese strategic thinking lay in ruins, discredited by events. Officers who had planned the Z-Plan, who had fortified the Marshall Islands, who had believed in decisive battle and spiritual superiority, had to confront the reality that they had been comprehensively outthought by an enemy they had underestimated. The legacy of the Marshall Islands campaign extends far beyond World War II. Modern military doctrine around the world incorporates lessons learned from American innovation in 1944. The idea of bypassing enemy strengths to strike at weaknesses has become fundamental to contemporary strategic thinking. Special operations forces exist largely to implement this principle, hitting targets that conventional forces can't or won't defend adequately. Cyber warfare operates on similar logic, attacking through networks rather than across battlefields, making traditional defenses irrelevant. Even conventional military planning emphasizes speed and maneuver over positional warfare, seeking to dislocate enemy forces rather than engage in grinding battles of attrition. The ghost of Admiral Akiyama watches over all of it, a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming you know how the next war will be fought. Business schools teach the Marshall Islands campaign as an example of disruptive innovation. Students learn how American forces didn't compete on Japanese terms, but changed the competitive landscape entirely. The parallels to companies like Apple or Amazon or Tesla disrupting established industries are obvious. You don't win by being slightly better at what everyone else is doing. You win by making what everyone else is doing irrelevant. But the deeper lesson is harder to teach because it's psychological rather than tactical. Recognizing when you need to abandon your current framework and adopt a completely new one requires a kind of intellectual humility that's difficult to maintain, especially when you've been successful using your current approach. Japanese military leaders in 1944 had spent their entire careers developing expertise in a particular form of warfare. Acknowledging that this expertise had become obsolete would have required admitting that their life's work had been surpassed by events. Most people, most organizations can't make that leap. They defend their existing frameworks even as evidence mounts that those frameworks no longer match reality. The storm that killed Admiral Koga was meteorological, but the strategic storm the Americans unleashed was far more devastating to Japanese military planning. In 4 days at Kwajalein, then across months of island-hopping campaigns, American forces demonstrated that wars can be won by refusing to fight battles your enemy wants. The fortress islands stood empty, monuments to strategic thinking that had become obsolete overnight. The soldiers trapped on those islands experienced the unique horror of becoming irrelevant, watching the war they'd prepared for sail past just beyond reach. For them, the psychological defeat was perhaps worse than physical destruction would have been. They had been rendered meaningless, their fortifications and training and courage all made pointless by an enemy who simply chose not to engage them.